Hello, 8th grade. This is Mr. Crutcher again, and we are going to be discussing our last unit of the school year, Chapter 30, the Vietnam Era from 1960 to 1975. And the first section, Section 1, is titled Kennedy's Foreign Policy. New Directions. Now, when President Kennedy took over office, he continued his anti-communist policies of his predecessors, but with a few changes. He led the Americans to believe that the nation had fewer nuclear missiles than the Soviet Union, which helped them increase spending on nuclear arms. And he tried to convince the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, to agree to a ban on nuclear testing. And there you can see Khrushchev right there. Strength through flexibility. Now, in certain areas of the world, communist groups fought to take control of their nation's government. And the problem was many of these groups were receiving aid from the Soviet Union. And we were kind of in a start of a Cold War with the Soviet Union already. Now, these groups, their tactics they used was called guerrilla warfare. They were just hit and run techniques. They would, or ambushes. They do quick attacks and then they would retreat, and that's how they fought their war. So President Kennedy comes up with this plan. He called it flexible response, and his plan used special military units to fight guerrilla warfare. And one of the American Special Forces, one of the better known, were called the Green Berets. So he had this group he was able to send them out throughout the world and fight guerrilla warfare style. He also had strength through aid. The poor countries, the thought of communism, it appealed to many of them. So Kennedy believed that American foreign aid to these poor countries around the world would make promises of communism seem less attractive. So on March 1st, 1961, he signed an executive order creating the Peace Corps. And an executive order is just a rule issued by the chief executive that has the force of the law. Now, the Peace Corps, these were volunteers, American volunteers, to go over to countries and work, and many of them worked as teachers, health workers, and agricultural advisors. Another program he came up with was Alliance for Progress, and this was a 10-year plan to promote Latin America's growth. And he promised Latin American leaders that the U.S. would assist free men and free governments in casting off the chains of poverty. Once again, his reasoning was, we help, especially with finances. Hopefully this would prevent the rise of communist states in that region. Cold War confrontations. Now, when President Kennedy took office, he faced some serious foreign policy situations. One was happening in Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro had seized power. And the problem was Cuba formed an alliance with the Soviet Union. So the American CIA formed a plan to overthrow Castro. Now, this wasn't during Kennedy's administration. This was happening in Eisenhower's administration. And in this plan, they would have the Cuban refugees living in the U.S. return to Cuba. The CIA would train these refugees. They would return to Cuba. They would spark an uprising, and then they would overthrow the communist government. Kennedy had a lot of doubts about this plan, but he decided to allow it and to let it go forward. And that was a big mistake on his part, because it became known as the Bay of Pigs. As you can see in the map here, this is where the invasion was taking place. So in April 1961, the 1,500 CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. It wasn't even really a confrontation. The Cuban forces crushed the invasion. Kennedy, he took the blame, and he was really embarrassed by his failure. And you get three consequences for President Kennedy out of this. One, he loses faith. He lost faith in the military and his intelligence advice. Two, the Latin American nations lost faith in Kennedy. And three, probably the most important, was that the Soviet leader, Khrushchev, he felt that now Kennedy was weak and that he could be bullied. And this would play a vital role in the Cuban Missile Crisis that we'll talk about here in a couple minutes. Before we talk about that, we need to talk about the Berlin Wall. Now, after World War II, as you can recall, land was divided, and but the status of Germany had not been settled. So you had the Soviet Union controlling East Germany, and while the West, the Soviet Union controlled East Germany, you had Berlin. They were surrounded by the communist East Germany, and it was split. West Berlin was a non-communist, and it was protected by the Americans, the British, and the French. Well, what ends up happening in 1961, a large number of East Germans fled to the west side of Germany, West Germany, through West Berlin. Well, the East German government did not like that. So what they do, with the backing of the Soviet Union, they built the Berlin Wall. And this wall would cut communications between East and West Germany. And basically, the East Germans forbid anyone from going over to West Germany. And this is a picture of the Berlin Wall in 1962. You could see the concrete wall, and up the top there's barbed wire, so people couldn't go over it. Now we come to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was probably one of the most scariest events in U.S. history. What happens in October 1962, photos from an American spy plane going over Cuba revealed that the Soviet Union was building nuclear missile launch sites on the island. So on October 22nd, President Kennedy spoke on national television and revealed as he called it, the secret, swift, and extraordinary buildup of missiles in Cuba. Now, he had his advisors, he had several ideas of what to do, but he decided to order a blockade of Cuba until the Soviets agreed to remove missiles. And he promised to destroy any Soviet ship that tried to break through the blockade. He also stated that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be considered an attack on U.S. by the Soviet Union, and it would be met with a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. And keep in mind, remember, Khrushchev, he thinks Kennedy can be bullied. So he's probably thinking, I want to see how far I can go before this guy gets to his breaking point. Well, Kennedy holds his ground, and after a few tense days, it was actually 13 days, it was known as 13 days, the Soviet ships turned back, and the Soviet leaders agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. And here's a map of the range for the missiles that were in Cuba. Here's Cuba right here. You could see this first range right here. It went about 800 miles. From the tip of Florida to Cuba is only 90 miles. So this first range was about 800. This second range is a little over 1100. And then this third range was a little over 2500. And you can see that that third range there, it would cover most of the United States except for the northwestern part and, of course, Hawaii and Alaska. So that was a real scary situation. If they let those missiles off, you can see where they could attack, and especially, the southeastern part of the U.S. could be destroyed easily. So having come close to a nuclear war, the U.S. and the Soviet Union started to work and establish a better relationship. And they created in 1963 a hotline between Washington and Moscow, just to allow the American and Soviet leaders to communicate instantly during a time of crisis. And also in that same year, the two nations signed a treaty banning nuclear tests above ground and underwater. However, the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued to compete in the space race during the Kennedy administration. And that space race began in 1957 with the launch of the Soviet Union Sputnik, which was the world's first satellite. Then you get the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first person to orbit Earth. Well, a month later, Alan Shepard Jr. became the first American to make a space flight. Kennedy was happy, but he thought we could do more. He challenged the nation to land a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth by the end of the decade. So funding for NASA was expanded along with its facilities in Florida and Texas. In February 1962, John Glenn orbited Earth in a spacecraft. And finally, in July of 1969, American astronaut Neil Armstrong took the first human steps on the moon. That was part of the Apollo project. And this is a video of him landing on the moon and his famous quotes, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Now, that concludes section 1. Here's some discussion questions to think about. I was going to have this as a homework assignment, but I don't know if we'll have time or not. So just consider these questions. Question number 1. How did President Kennedy think foreign aid could fight communism? We'll probably discuss these on Monday. Question number 2. What were the 3 consequences of the Bay of Pigs invasion for President Kennedy? And number 3, could the Cuban Missile Crisis have led to nuclear war? Explain. So those 3 questions, keep in mind. Like I said, we'll probably discuss these the first thing on Monday, and then start section 2, which is actually the war in Vietnam.